The mighty, mighty Thor! Thor is kind of an interesting comic book movie in that Thor really isn't really a superhero per se, because he doesn't really fight crime. He's not really out to save the world. In a way, he sort of doesn't really exist on the normal human plane of existence. He's more or less just a Norwegian folklore god who is only protecting his faraway realm out in the outer reaches of the universe. So Thor is pretty interesting in that aspect, in that it's not just like Spider-Man who's saving the damsel in distress, or Batman who's, standing up for the corrupt underbelly of society and is just a disturbed individual. Thor is just, a majestic piece of heroic narrative that you don't really see too often in comic book movies. And I'm not a comic book fan, and I noticed that a lot of times with comic book movies, there seem to be two different schools of thought or perceptions of a comic book movie. Because comic book movies come from source materials, i.e. comics, they're so slavishly devoted to the source material, the comic book fans, that it almost seems like it's impossible to please the people who see the comic book movies, because they always, most of the time, they get so upset with the way how they differ from the source material. But yet, for someone who hasn't read the comic books like me, I've never been much of a comic book fan, you sort of have to view them on just their own merits. Like, for one example, when I saw Spider-Man 3, and there was little to no Venom in that movie, I saw it with a friend who was a huge fan of Spider-Man, and that was one of his biggest problems. It was almost a total killer for him for the whole movie, was just the fact that Venom was barely in it. To me, not being a fan of the comic books, not because I didn't like them or anything, I just never got into them, but I enjoy comic book movies. The fact that Venom wasn't in Spider-Man 3 really much didn't really bother me at all, because I didn't have that sort of devotion to the comics as he did. But I'm kind of getting a little off track there. But so basically, the story of Thor, without trying to get too nerdy or complex about the whole story, it's this place called Asgard, full of Norwegian gods and myths and all that stuff. It gets a little too complicated, but Thor plays a prince of Asgard, as does one of his brothers, Loki. And his father, played by Anthony Hopkins, is getting old and is going to step down from the throne and is going to make Thor the new king. Long story short, Thor is a total dick. He's arrogant, he is violent, he seeks out war, he's very bloodthirsty, and through his actions and almost getting people killed, he is denied entrance to the throne and is sent to Earth to live with humans forever, or so they say. And then eventually his brother Loki finds out that he's not really Anthony Hopkins' son, and he was part of the Frost Giants clan, and ends up turning evil. And then Thor finds out about it through ways, which is too complicated to talk about now. And so basically what happens is that Thor basically plays out like almost like a Shakespearean tale of two brothers fighting over who gets to take over the throne. And Thor kind of plays almost in a way it's almost like a coming of age movie in a weird way if you think about it, because they even say at one point that Thor's actions should just be taken as an arrogant young boy, and he's sent away, and he is completely aggravated by the fact that he's been sent away. He feels that he's in the right and that what he's doing needs to be done, and he finds out later on that his father's words of, being peaceful and not seeking out war was actually the right thing to do. And through that action of finding out that, you don't need to be such a war-hungry king in order to be a successful king, he becomes king eventually by finding out the error of his ways. So that's another thing about Thor that was very interesting, in that it was a very classical tale on a comic book movie. Like I said, I've never been a comic book fan, so I don't know if that sort of angle of, the two brothers who fight over the throne, and one brother turning evil and ends up becoming the villain that he has to defend, is something that was in the original comic. But even if it wasn't, the guy who directed this movie, Kenneth Branagh, who at first glimpse, it's sort of a little bit of, a head tilter to think Kenneth Branagh, because he's done a lot of really classy Shakespearean film adaptations. He did Henry V, for which he got a whole bunch of Oscar nominations for, and then he also did the even more popular Shakespeare tale, Hamlet. So for him to start doing a comic book movie, again, I don't know much about Thor, so I wasn't, but I knew it was a comic book movie, so I was like, why is a guy who's, was doing Shakespeare is now trying to do this, huge mega blockbuster comic book movie? But after watching it, it kind of makes sense, because the one thing that it does focus on, and then I think it does very well, is the way that they show the dramatic, pulling of emotions and changing of emotions, specifically with Thor, from his transformation from an arrogant young boy to a wise young man. And it really worked. But even when you've got that, the one thing that makes it stand out even more is its incredible visual effects. I saw this in the IMAX 3D format, and it was a perfect setting for it, in my opinion. The images in it were so, the special effects were done in such a way that it almost felt like a Renaissance painting, done way of George Lucas ILM or something like that. There were a couple scenes. One of them is the one where the Ottoman, this big giant metal, almost kind of like reminiscent of an Iron Man type mechanical giant, is sent down to Earth to kill Thor, in this order to kill Thor by Loki, and ends up blowing up this very small town out in New Mexico. It's a very small scale action set piece, in that it's such a small city, and there's not, it's not like huge skyscrapers around. And I thought that was pretty interesting to see such a, climactic battle scene taking place in such a rural area, where there's not too much to be destroyed, but everything that can be destroyed is destroyed, rest assured. So that was interesting. I think probably about the only thing that really did not work in this movie, that kind of upset me a little bit, was the romance that was supposed to be happening between Natalie Portman and Chris Hemsworth, who plays Thor in this movie. Chris Hemsworth plays an excellent Thor, by the way. He's, obviously got the right build and physique for it. But he also is very good at, that changing emotion that I talked about, of playing the, distraught, arrogant, bloodthirsty young man, and then at a middle point in the movie realizing that he has been cast out from Argos and has to just live amongst the humans. And for a while he kind of plays that role too, as just a guy who understands that this is where he's brought himself. And then also at the very end playing the very wise and noble king that he ends up becoming. But yet him and Natalie Portman together, who plays a young scientist who studies constellations in the stars, and is the first one to discover Thor when he's cast out into the human realm. And through her, talking with him, wanting to find out what more he knows about these giant, storm systems or constellations that keep coming down from the sky. They sort of try to play it off that they're romantically involved, but to be honest, it doesn't really exist any more than on a purely physical level for them. They don't really have much in common, of course, because he's from a distant planet out amongst the far reaches of the universe, and she's just a young scientist living on Earth. What could they possibly have in common on an emotional level at all? It's got to be just physical, in that she just sees him as this, he really is a god. To be honest, he's a a god of men. So I don't think I don't think it would have been possible at all to try and make any sort of romantic connection between the two. It would just be impossible. So that was one thing that didn't work at all. Because at the very end, when he has to go back, he says he'll come back for her, and then they have that passionate kiss at the end. But they really didn't have too much in common, except that they were the most attractive looking people in the movie, so they had to be together, and that's it. But all in all, Thor was a very unconventional comic book movie, but it was very refreshing that it was so unconventional from most comic book movies. So I would give it. I would say I would give it a B plus. The only thing that's keeping it from being an A is that romance. Either they should have tried to find a way, although I don't know how they would have, to make the romance more palpable and more realistic, or they should have just done away with it completely and had no romantic, undertones between Thor and Natalie Portman at all. So I'd give it a solid B plus. I'd say definitely go see it, even if you aren't a comic book fan, which I'm not, and I really, really enjoyed it. So B plus on Thor.